Usually when we talk about a country's economy, there's this underlying assumption that we're all basically on the same boat.
Right, like the standard macroeconomic view.
Exactly. Sure, some passengers might be riding in first class and, others are crammed back in economy. But if the boat is moving forward, well, everyone is generally moving forward. And if it hits a storm, everybody gets wet.
Yeah, that's the assumption. One nation, one unified economic trajectory, all tethered together by a single central bank and, a federal government.
But looking at the sources we're unpacking for today's deep dive, and we're looking at a huge stack of projections stretching from right now, April 2026, all the way to 2036, that boat is completely broken in half.
It really is. I mean, it's a radical fracturing.
Yeah, Australia is physically and financially splitting into two entirely different realities, and it's based purely on geography. It's this unprecedented split driven by a perfect storm of, well, inflation, artificial intelligence, and some just staggering state-level debt.
And to really grasp how this fracturing impacts you, the listener, whether you're mapping out your career, looking to buy a house, or just trying to protect your investments over the next decade, we first have to really ground ourselves in the reality of today.
Right. We need to set the scene.
Exactly. Because we are firmly entrenched in a high-interest new normal right now. The Reserve Bank of Australia has its cash rate sitting at a very painful 4.10%.
Ouch. Yeah.
Meanwhile, GDP growth is heavily downgraded. It's barely crawling, somewhere between 1.3% and 1.9%. And inflation, it has spiked right back up to between 4.2% and 5.4%.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of that a bit, because numbers alone can be, well, a bit abstract.
Sure.
Imagine the 2026 economy is a car, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to drive down the highway. The high interest rates, that 4.10%, they act like the parking brake being jammed on.
Right, because the central bank is deliberately starving businesses and households of cheap credit.
Exactly. They want them to stop spending. They're actively trying to slow the car down. But at the exact same time, the fuel itself, the fundamental cost of energy, logistics, and materials, has basically doubled in price.
That's a great way to look at it. And I'll take that car analogy a step further, actually. Not only is the fuel incredibly expensive, but the global supply chain that delivers that fuel is actively breaking down.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah. And that's really the first of three massive national pressures we're facing right now. Deglobalization and the prolonged conflict involving Iran have essentially trapped global oil prices in this structural elevated range. We're talking $90 to $110 per barrel.
And because it costs an absolute fortune to move goods around or, run manufacturing equipment, companies had to pass those costs directly onto you at the checkout.
Exactly. Which explains why simply raising interest rates isn't magically fixing the inflation problem.
Right, because you can jack up the cost of a mortgage all you want, but it doesn't make a barrel of diesel any cheaper to refine.
Precisely. That's supply-side inflation in a nutshell. Interest rates really only control the demand side. So the RBA is holding the rate at 4.00%, which leads us to the second pressure, the crushing reality for households.
Yeah, people were really holding their breath for rate cuts last year. Right?
They were, but instead, that sustained 4.0% is actively cannibalizing household consumption and business investment. I mean, companies just aren't borrowing to expand, and families are pouring every spare dollar into their mortgages rather than, spending it at local businesses.
Which brings us to the third pressure, and honestly, this is the one I find the most fascinating. Artificial general intelligence, or AGI.
Yes, the AI double-edged sword.
Yeah, because in the short term, like right now in 2026, the sources say AI is driving severe job loss, up to 200,000 jobs, actually. But wait, I have to push back here for a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
Historically, when we talk about massive technological disruption, it almost always hits blue-collar work first, right? Like we think of robotic arms on assembly lines or automated mining trucks. But AI is doing the exact opposite here, isn't it?
It is. It's completely flipping the script, and that fundamentally changes the economic geography of the country. AGI doesn't have a physical body to pour concrete or wire a house.
Right.
But what it can do is instantly process immense amounts of information, generate complex code, manage administrative workflows, so it is uniquely targeting junior accountants, mid-level HR managers, software developers, legal assistants.
So the robots aren't coming for the factory floor, they're coming for the cubicle.
Exactly. We are seeing a real hollowing out of traditional mid-tier knowledge work. Now, long term, by the early 2030s, this AI integration promises a massive productivity boom.
Like once companies figure out how to actually leverage it to build new products.
Right. It will create entirely new economic engines, but
Yeah.
right now we're in the messy transition phase, and the white-collar workforce has taken the absolute brunt of the hit.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit and map this onto the country itself, because anyone who has lived through the last 20 years might be thinking, well, Australia's had massive resource booms before.
Oh, absolutely. The 2000s mining boom was historically huge.
Right. So why is this current shift structurally different? Like, why didn't the country split in half back then?
Well, if we look at the mechanics of the 2000s boom, it was essentially a single terms of trade shock. That's an economic term that basically means the ratio of our export prices to our import prices just skyrocketed.
So we were selling things for way more than we were buying them.
Exactly. The rest of the world, primarily China, suddenly wanted everything we could dig out of the ground, and they were paying premium prices. Meanwhile, the TVs and the consumer goods we were buying from them were getting cheaper.
Right. It was a massive influx of cash.
Oh,
I mean, I remember the eastern states, New South Wales and Victoria, complaining a bit back then because the Australian dollar got so strong, it made their local manufacturing less competitive globally.
Yes, the classic Dutch disease effect.
Yeah, exactly. But overall, it was like a rising tide. The resource states bought bigger yachts, sure, but the tide mostly lifted all boats.
True, because the underlying conditions were entirely different. Back in the 2000s, national inflation was incredibly low, and government debt was basically non-existent compared to where we are today.
So what's causing the split now?
Today's divergence is a perfect storm of four overlapping factors happening simultaneously. First, you have extreme fiscal debt imbalances between the states. Second, high domestic interest rates paired with that structural imported supply-side inflation we talked about.
Right, the expensive oil.
Yes. Third, AI is wiping out the traditional service sector jobs that usually drive city economies. And fourth, there is an irreversible global transition toward green energy, which requires new critical minerals.
And the sources also point out a policy reality making this even harder on the East Coast. Now, just objectively reporting what's in the analysis here, the eastern states are dealing with the economic friction of left-leaning policies alongside these macro pressures.
Right. We're talking about higher regulatory hurdles and tighter property taxes in the East. And mechanically, that slows down corporate pivots.
Because when you increase the cost of compliance and taxation on businesses, it takes them much longer to adapt to macro pressures like AI and supply chain shocks.
Exactly. It's an added layer of economic friction right when they need agility the most. It creates a brutal compounding effect. And when we look at how this perfect storm actually hits the ground, we see what economists in the reports are calling the East Coast squeeze.
The East Coast squeeze.
Yeah. New South Wales and Victoria are undergoing a structural shift that will essentially dictate their public infrastructure and living standards for the next decade.
Okay, let's start with Sydney. Sydney is a city built largely on real estate, finance, IT, and administrative services. Under a 4.10% interest rate, households are suffocating under mortgage debt.
Oh, absolutely.
But because their economy is so heavily concentrated in those white-collar sectors, they're also absorbing the brunt of the AI job cuts. The sources cite significant early 2026 layoffs at major tech stalwarts there. We're talking Atlassian, WiseTech, Block.
And this is where state-level government debt goes from being just like, a spreadsheet problem to a real-world anchor. New South Wales is projecting its debt to hit 19.2% of its gross state product, or GSP, by 2028.
Wow. Okay, just to put GSP in perspective for you listening, think of it as the entire economic output of the state for a year.
Right. And having nearly 20% of that equal to your debt means a massive chunk of the state's tax revenue doesn't go to building new schools or fixing roads. It goes straight to paying interest to bondholders.
So Sydney is being forced to pull off this incredibly painful transition. They can no longer rely on an economy driven by easy credit and endless real estate flipping. They have to pivot toward a digital and services export economy.
Yeah, they're heavily anchoring their hopes on the new Western Sydney aerotropolis to drive future growth.
But pulling that off while bleeding tax revenue to interest payments, I mean, that is a monumental task.
It really is. But if Sydney is feeling the squeeze, Melbourne's situation is a full-blown fiscal crisis.
Let's talk about Melbourne. Demographically, Melbourne is a behemoth right now.
It is. It's on track to surpass Sydney in population somewhere between 2032 and 2037.
But Victoria faces the worst debt crisis in the entire country. The numbers here say their net debt is projected to peak at a staggering 25.2% of GSP next year in 2027.
Which is just astronomical.
Okay, hold on. I need to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
If Melbourne is adding so many people that it's going to become the biggest city in the country, doesn't that massive population scale naturally solve their debt problem? Like more people means more taxpayers,
Yeah.
now you just grow your way out of the hole?
It's a completely logical assumption, but it ignores the fundamental difference between sheer population growth and actual per capita economic productivity. Well, think about it. Adding another 100,000 people to a city only generates net revenue for the state if those people are highly productive.
Right.
If you add 100,000 people, but they are spending 2 hours a day stuck in gridlock traffic, or they're working in low-output, fragmented jobs because the city's infrastructure just can't support them, the tax revenue they generate simply doesn't cover the cost of the public services they consume.
Ah, okay. So sheer volume isn't enough if the machine itself is inefficient.
Exactly. And because Victoria's debt interest is swallowing so much state revenue, the government has been forced into a corner. To balance the books, they've implemented highly restrictive, investor-unfriendly tax policies.
Like what?
Well, they've lowered land tax thresholds so more small property owners get hit and introduced heavy, short-stay accommodation taxes. Mechanically, capital flows to where it's treated best.
Right. Money always finds the path of least resistance.
Always. So we are seeing real capital flight. Investors are simply pulling their money out of Victoria and putting it into other states.
Which brings us to Melbourne's ultimate gamble, the Suburban Rail Loop, or the SRL. This is a gargantuan infrastructure project, right? It's designed to completely transform the city's layout.
Yes. Instead of everyone commuting into the central business district, the SRL is supposed to connect the middle ring suburbs, decentralizing jobs and creating high productivity hubs outside the city center.
It sounds like an all-or-nothing bet.
It absolutely is. If the SRL succeeds in creating those highly productive interconnected suburbs, Melbourne might eventually boost its per capita output enough to manage its debt.
But if it fails?
If it fails, or if the cost blowouts are too severe, that 25.2% debt load will act as a concrete anchor. For the average listener living there, it means a decade of stagnant living standards.
Like what? Longer hospital wait times?
Longer hospital wait times, underfunded schools, crumbling local roads, because the state simply has no fiscal capacity to invest in local infrastructure.
Wow. That is the grim reality of the East Coast fault line. Highly leveraged, heavily taxed, and battling AI disruptions. Now let's pivot sharply to the other side of the country, because the contrast here is just wild.
It really is night and day.
While Melbourne is taxing landlords just to keep the lights on, Perth and Brisbane are essentially operating in a completely different financial universe. They are cash-rich, energy-independent, and pulling in massive internal migration that will completely reshape them by 2036.
The contrast couldn't be starker. Western Australia is currently functioning as a macroeconomic fortress.
A fortress, I like that.
They have the lowest debt in the country, sitting at a microscopic 7.6% of GSP.
Compare that to Victoria's 25.2%.
Exactly. But their biggest structural advantage isn't just low debt. It's the WA domestic gas reservation policy.
Now, looking at the sources, this policy is arguably the single most important piece of legislation dictating the country's economic split. Walk us through how this mechanically shields them from all that chaos on the East Coast.
Sure. So years ago, Western Australia mandated that a significant portion of all natural gas extracted in the state must be reserved for domestic use. It legally cannot be exported.
Okay.
Now, remember the first national pressure we discussed? Global supply shocks driving energy prices through the roof because of deglobalization and conflict.
Right, the $90 or $110 a barrel oil.
Yes. The East Coast is fully exposed to that. They have an interconnected grid and international export contracts, meaning businesses in Sydney or Melbourne basically pay global premiums to keep their factories running.
But because Perth quarantined its own gas supply, the local market is just flooded with energy.
Precisely. Prices crash domestically while global prices soar. Perth businesses enjoy cheap, protected local energy. Their operating costs are artificially, structurally lower than the rest of the country.
It is a massive competitive moat, and it trickles right down to the individual listener living there, right?
Yeah.
Perth has the highest average full-time weekly wages in the country, hitting $2,303.
It's an incredible combination. Think about it. Your energy bill is lower than a family in Sydney, your local businesses are thriving because their overheads are cheap, and your paycheck is significantly larger.
So when the RBA hits the 4.1 air percent parking brake, the East Coast goes through the windshield, but Perth barely feels a bump.
Barely feels it. And crucially, Perth isn't resting on its laurels. They aren't just relying on the old iron ore playbook anymore. They are actively utilizing this massive cash surplus to transition into processing critical minerals.
Like lithium, copper, rare earths.
Exactly. The exact materials required for the global green energy transition. They're building a structural advantage that will insulate them for decades to come.
And then you have Brisbane, which is entering what the economists and our sources are dubbing its golden decade.
Yes, Queensland is absorbing a massive wave of interstate migration. People are looking at their huge mortgage in Sydney, looking at their rising tax bill in Melbourne, and physically relocating north.
And Queensland has the cash to actually welcome them, thanks to incredibly strong revenues from coal royalties.
They are taking that commodity windfall and pouring it directly into a $116.8 billion infrastructure pipeline ahead of the 2032 Olympics.
That is a massive number.
It's a textbook example of leveraging a temporary resource boom to build permanent, long-term public infrastructure capacity.
Though it's not entirely without friction, right? I mean, you can't just inject $116 billion into a city's construction sector without breaking a few things.
True. True. The sheer velocity of Brisbane's buildouts creating severe short-term labor shortages. You simply cannot find enough engineers, electricians, or builders, which leads to immediate construction cost blowouts.
Right. But when you look at the long-term wealth generation, the property markets really tell the story. Over the next decade, property prices in Perth and Brisbane are forecast to see double-digit growth. We're talking somewhere between 10% and 13%.
Yes. Compare that to the heavily indebted stagnant markets of Sydney and Melbourne, which are bracing for anemic growth of just 1% to 6%.
It's a fascinating, almost poetic irony. For decades, the financial heavyweights down in Sydney and Melbourne kind of wrote off places like Perth and Brisbane as just, isolated mining towns or sleepy northern capitals.
Oh, absolutely.
But right now, they are the absolute safest financial harbors in the nation. They have the cash, they have the energy independence, and they have the demographic momentum.
Which paints a very clear picture of what Australia looks like by 2036. The country will have fundamentally reorganized itself. Perth and Brisbane will have capitalized on their resource wealth and massive infrastructure investments to attract top-tier talent.
Right.
They'll establish themselves as primary economic powerhouses. Their regional living standards will likely far outpace the rest of the country.
Meanwhile, Sydney and Melbourne will have spent a grueling lost decade just trying to repair their balance sheets. They will be relying desperately on the long-term productivity boosts from AI and massive risky infrastructure gambles like the suburban rail loop just to dig themselves out from under the weight of that state debt.
And this is really the core takeaway for you, the listener. The era of the single national economy is essentially dead.
Wow.
If you are charting out your career path, trying to start a business, or deciding where to buy property over the next 10 years, you cannot just look at national GDP or national employment figures anymore.
It doesn't give you the real picture.
Not at all. You have to interrogate the specific macroeconomic climate of your state. You have to ask, what is my state government's debt to GSP ratio? Are they heavily exposed to AI job disruptions? Do they have energy independence? Because your personal wealth over the next decade is now inextricably linked to the balance sheet of your local state government.
The boat really has split in half. You need to know which piece of wreckage you're standing on or which new ship you're boarding. And that leaves us with a lingering, provocative question to wrap up today's deep dive. We started with the analogy of a central bank trying to drive a car with the parking brake on. But if Australia is now effectively two entirely different economies, one being a booming, cash-rich, energy-independent resource hub, and the other a highly leveraged, heavily taxed, debt-burdened service center facing massive AI job disruptions, how much longer can a single national institution like the Reserve Bank realistically set one single interest rate for the whole country?
That's a huge question.
Right. I mean, if 4.10% barely slows down Perth but completely suffocates Melbourne, is federal intervention eventually going to be required just to keep the country financially united? It's definitely something to think about.